While the Vietnam War has been engraved into the American zeitgeist, the Korean War remains a largely forgotten event. Yet this 3-year conflict claimed nearly 5 million lives, more casualties than any 20th century conflict except the 2 world wars. Today, we explore how this peninsula became the first hot battlefield of the Cold War and why its legacy continues to shape our world. In the middle of larger powers, Korea had developed a distinct national identity over thousands of years, with its own language, writing system, and cultural traditions. But its geography made it vulnerable to foreign intervention. After the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan began encroaching on the Korean kingdom, then known as Joseon. By 1905, Korea had become a Japanese protectorate, and in 1907, administrative affairs were transferred to the Japanese government. 2 years later, a treaty officially transferred governance of Korea to the Emperor of Japan. Despite bearing the emperor's seal, this was no peaceful transition. The Koreans were treated as a conquered people. The Japanese implemented their version of military rule, Budansiji, and began a systematic campaign to erase Korean culture and identity. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, forbidden from speaking their language in schools, and their historical artifacts were removed to Japan. This was not mere colonization. It was an attempt at cultural obliteration. The Korean people, proud of their cultural traditions and accustomed to self-rule within the Chinese orbit, refused to submit quietly. On March 1, 1919, 33 activists publicly read a Korean Declaration of Independence in Seoul, broadcasting their grievances via radio and newspapers. The Japanese response was swift and brutal. Thousands were killed, with many more imprisoned and tortured. But rather than stifle resistance, this violence only strengthened the Korean resolve. The Japanese occupation created perfect conditions for resistance movements to flourish. Young, educated civil servants and military officers resented the lack of opportunities, while a select few Korean elites grew wealthy through collaboration with Japanese occupiers. The majority were made landless and reduced to poverty. Several nationalist movements emerged: student activists, exiles in Soviet Russia and China, the Righteous Army, peasant movements, and guerrilla operations in Manchuria. What they lacked was a unifying banner to rally the population. Then, on August 15, 1945, everything changed. Japan surrendered to Allied forces, ending its 35-year occupation of the Korean Peninsula. After decades of oppression, Koreans celebrated their liberation, but their joy would be short-lived. As World War II wound down, the fate of Korea had become a question mark in Allied planning. President Roosevelt had been unsure of Koreans' capacity to govern themselves after decades under Japanese rule. He envisioned Korea being administered by a council of the 4 major powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and Great Britain. Roosevelt died before any concrete plan could be implemented. When Harry Truman took office, he quickly abandoned the idea of joint trusteeship and began searching for alternatives. Events moved faster than American planners anticipated. 2 days after the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Red Army rapidly moved into North Korea, defeating the Japanese Kwantung Army that defended the northern half of the peninsula. By August 10th, just after the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, 250,000 Soviet troops, accompanied by 35,000 Soviet Koreans, had occupied several prominent cities in North Korea. Washington was in a panic, desperately trying to prevent the complete annexation of Korea by the Soviet Union. In a hasty decision, American officials proposed the 38th parallel as a temporary demarcation line. Surprisingly, Stalin accepted. Korea was officially divided. The United States and its allies would influence the South, while the Soviets occupied the North. This arbitrary line, drawn by American officers with little knowledge of Korea's geography, economics, or culture, would become one of the most heavily fortified borders in world history. When American forces arrived in the South, they were shocked by what they found: widespread support for left-leaning politics and economic chaos. The arbitrary division had separated the industrial North from the agricultural South. Factories were cut off from raw materials, farms from their markets. The heavy industries and plants that had transformed the Korean economy under the Japanese were now predominantly located in the North under Soviet control. The South was left with limited infrastructure and mounting problems. Running running out of options and unable to effectively manage the situation. The United States submitted the Korean issue to the United Nations in 1947. The UN General Assembly upheld Korea's claim to independence and began preparing for elections, but the Soviet Union refused to concede the North. It became clear that the 1948 elections would be for a separate government to govern the South alone. As the public realized these elections would cement Korea's division, protests erupted in Seoul and other major cities. Many Koreans felt betrayed. After 35 years of Japanese occupation, they now faced the prospect of permanent division, a new tragedy imposed by foreign powers. In the North, amidst dynamic interactions of various political factions vying for power, Kim Il-sung emerged as the leader of the Workers' Party of North Korea. In September 1948, Kim was sworn in as premier of the newly formed Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. The Soviet Union quickly declared Kim's government the only lawful government on the peninsula. In December, the United Nations General Assembly responded by declaring the Republic of Korea in the South the only legal government of Korea. The stage was set for conflict. On June 25, 1950, North Korea's Korean People's Army charged across the 38th parallel, catching American observers by surprise. The South Korean government claimed to be equally shocked, though evidence suggests President Syngman-rhee was likely preparing for a northern invasion of his own. The North Korean forces were well equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They had been planning this offensive for months, with the blessing of both Stalin and Mao Zedong. In the 5 days following the invasion, chaos engulfed South Korea. President Syngman-rhee fled Seoul in his special train, moving the entire Republic of Korean Army headquarters southward without properly communicating with troops fighting north of the city. Civilians panicked, clogging roads with refugees. By June 28th, the Korean People's Army had captured Seoul. In Washington, President Truman faced a crucial decision. In Korea, the government forces, which were armed to prevent border raids and to preserve internal security, were attacked by invading forces from North Korea. I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support. Truman's decision to commit ground forces to Korea represented a fundamental shift in American foreign policy. Just a year earlier, in 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. The specter of nuclear war made direct confrontation between superpowers too dangerous. Instead, they would fight through proxies far from their respective homelands. By late July, 47,000 Americans were fighting alongside 45,000 South Koreans against 70,000 North Koreans. But the retreat continued. The North Korean forces had severely surpassed American expectations. They were an effective fighting force, skilled in guerrilla warfare. They had women among their ranks and plenty of sympathizers in the South. We weren't prepared for their tenacity. For the first weeks of the war, the Korean People's Army pushed relentlessly southward, forcing retreat after retreat from UN and South Korean forces. By August, the defenders had been pushed back to a small perimeter around the port city of Busan, a last foothold on the peninsula. As the summer of 1950 wore on, American General Douglas MacArthur proposed a bold counteroffensive, an amphibious landing at Incheon, dated far behind enemy lines. Military advisors considered the plan extremely risky, with treacherous tides and narrow approaches making the landing site difficult to navigate. MacArthur's Incheon landing was one of the most daring amphibious operations in military history. It caught the North Koreans completely by surprise. The gamble paid off. On September 15, 1950, UN forces landed at Incheon and rapidly pushed inland. Within days, they had recaptured Seoul and cut off North Korean supply lines. The Korean People's Army, suddenly finding itself surrounded and outmaneuvered, began a headlong retreat northward. By early October, UN forces had restored the 38th parallel divide, but they didn't stop there. With the North Koreans in retreat, MacArthur received permission to pursue them into North Korean territory. UN forces pushed northward, approaching the Chinese border at the Yalu River. This proved to be a critical miscalculation. China had repeatedly warned that it would not tolerate hostile forces near its border, but these warnings were dismissed in Washington. The Korean People's Army retreat was more strategic than it appeared, drawing UN forces closer to the Chinese border, where the Chinese People's Volunteer Army was massing. On November 27, 1950, the Chinese launched a massive counter-offensive. The Chinese came at night, thousands of them blowing bugles and whistles. It was terrifying. We were spread too thin, and they just poured through our lines. The Chinese attack cut through the Allied forces in one devastating sweep. Within weeks, they had eradicated UN forces from North Korea and recaptured Seoul for the Korean Communists. Once again, the tide of war had shifted. The winter of 1950-51 was one of the harshest on record. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy fire, but by spring, UN forces had regrouped, recaptured Seoul for the final time, and established defensive lines roughly along the 38th parallel. By June 1951, the battle lines had hardened and stabilized along lines similar to those that still scar the peninsula today. With neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, the Soviet Union's representative to the UN submitted a proposal for ceasefire discussions. At this point, all sides recognized that continued fighting would not fundamentally change the outcome. The war had reached a bloody stalemate. Talks began on July 10th in the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong. With stable battlefield lines, the war could have ended in 1951, but negotiations dragged on for 2 more years while soldiers continued to die along the 38th parallel. The talks were complicated by several factors: the status of prisoners of war, the exact positioning of the demarcation line, and international supervision of the armistice. But perhaps the biggest obstacle was South Korean President Syngman Rhee, who adamantly opposed any agreement that left Korea divided. Rhee released thousands of North Korean prisoners of war to sabotage the negotiations. He threatened to continue fighting alone if necessary. It took immense pressure from the United States to bring him reluctantly into line. Finally, on July 27, 1953, representatives of the United Nations Command, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, and the Korean People's Army signed an armistice agreement. A demarcation line was established roughly along the 38th parallel, with a buffer zone of 2.5 miles installed to prevent accidental escalation. Notably absent from the signing table was South Korea. Syngman Rhee refused to sign the agreement. No formal peace treaty was ever concluded. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It merely paused in an uneasy armistice that continues to this day. The Korean conflict claimed nearly 5 million casualties, with more than half being civilians. In the 20th century, only the 2 world wars claimed more lives. Yet in American memory, it remains the forgotten war, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after. The Korean War fundamentally shaped American Cold War policy. It led to NSC 68, which quadrupled defense spending. It cemented America's commitment to containing communism globally, and it established the pattern of limited warfare that would characterize the Cold War. For Korea, the war's legacy is unmistakable. The peninsula remains divided along roughly the same lines established in 1953. In the south, the Republic of Korea emerged from the war's devastation to become one of Asia's most vibrant democracies and technological powerhouses. In the north, the Kim dynasty established one of the world's most isolated and repressive regimes. 3 generations of the Kim family have ruled through cult of personality, military prioritization, and nuclear brinkmanship. Between them runs the demilitarized zone, ironically, one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. It stands as a physical embodiment of the Cold War, a remnant of a global conflict that reshaped international relations. For Koreans, there is nothing forgotten about this war. It divided families, destroyed cities, and created a wound in the Korean psyche that has yet to heal. The dream of reunification remains alive, but with each passing generation, the cultural divide grows wider. 70 years after its outbreak, the Korean War reminds us that conflicts rarely end neatly. The lines drawn hastily in the summer of 1945 have hardened into boundaries that separate not just territories, but ideologies, economies, and human connections. The Korean War may be forgotten by many, but its consequences live on, a testament to how decisions made in moments of crisis can shape the world for generations to come.